The wind, a constant, mournful guest, whistled through the gaps in Jebediah Stone's cabin, carrying the scent of pine and the distant, lonely howl of a wolf. His world was a small square box of rough-hewn logs, tucked away in a valley so remote that the nearest neighbor was a day's ride by horseback. Inside, the cabin was a testament to his singular existence. A cast-iron stove, perpetually smudged with soot, dominated one corner. A cot, perpetually rumpled, occupied another. A rough-hewn table, scarred by countless knife marks, held a chipped enamel plate and a tin cup, both currently empty. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy window panes, illuminating a general disarray that spoke of a man unburdened by domestic niceties. Jebediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-creased wrinkles and a permanent scowl, grumbled as he scraped a burnt offering of beans from his skillet. "Dog food," he muttered, tossing the blackened remains into a bucket for his scruffy hound, Old Blue, who eyed the proceedings with a weary resignation. His own stomach rumbled in protest, but the thought of another of his culinary experiments filled him with a deeper dread than hunger. For years he'd subsisted on simple, often unappetizing fare. Bread, tough as shoe leather, beans that always managed to be either too mushy or too hard, and the occasional stringy rabbit stew. The monotony, however, had begun to wear thin, like the threadbare patches on his work trousers. The cabin itself mirrored his internal landscape, a clutter of neglected chores. The floorboards, once a pale pine, were now a mosaic of tracked-in mud and forgotten wood chips. A half-finished mending project lay forgotten on a stool, needles still threaded. The scent of stale pipe smoke clung to everything, a heavy, permanent cloak. He was a capable man with an axe and a plow, but the finer points of keeping a home had always eluded him, and in truth, he'd never seen the need. Until now. He eyed the encroaching dust bunnies that had formed a small colony under his cot, then glanced at the stack of unwashed dishes that teetered precariously beside the dry sink. A sigh, heavy with resignation, escaped his lips. His independent spirit, a trait he prided himself on, was beginning to chafe under the weight of his own domestic incompetence. The thought of inviting someone else into his solitary domain was akin to inviting a pack of coyotes into his chicken coop, an unwelcome intrusion. Yet the alternative was a slow descent into a self-made mire of dirt and indigestible meals. "Confound it all," he grumbled, slamming his empty plate onto the table with more force than necessary. The decision, when it finally solidified in his mind, was not one of desire, but of grim necessity. He needed a housekeeper, someone to cook, to clean, to bring some semblance of order to his increasingly chaotic existence. He certainly didn't need company. That was the furthest thing from his mind. He just needed a pair of hands that knew their way around a broom and a stew pot. Tomorrow, he'd ride into town, a task he usually reserved for essential supplies, and tack a notice to the general store's bulletin board. The very thought felt like an admission of defeat, a concession to a world he'd purposefully kept at arm's length. A knock at the door, the persistent rap on the cabin door, echoed strangely in the afternoon quiet, pulling Jebediah from the meticulous sorting of dried herbs. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rarely did. With a grunt, he wiped his hands on his denim trousers and strode to the door, pulling it open with a practiced yank. Standing on his porch, silhouetted against the pale gold of the setting sun, was a woman, her frame slight beneath a worn shawl. And beside her, clutching the hem of her simple dress, was a child. A little girl, no bigger than a minute, with wide, apprehensive eyes that seemed to take in every splinter of his rough-hewn cabin. Jebediah's jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he rumbled, his voice rougher than intended. "Can I help you?" He'd advertised for a housekeeper, a sturdy woman to clean and cook, perhaps help with the small garden. He hadn't envisioned this. A mother and child. That complicated things. His cabin was no place for a little one. "Mr. Stone?" the woman asked, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Sarah Mae Jenkins. I saw your advertisement in Blackwood for a housekeeper." She gestured vaguely towards the small satchel at her feet, then to the girl. "This is Lily." Lily, sensing his scrutiny, edged further behind her mother's skirt, peeking out with those same large, expressive eyes. They were the color of deep river stones, and in their depths, Jebediah saw a weariness that shouldn't belong to such a young face. A flicker of something unexpected. A strange little tug resonated within his chest. He rubbed his beard, a familiar gesture when he was thinking. "A housekeeper, yes, but I didn't specify." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely between Sarah and Lily. "This isn't exactly a child-friendly abode, ma'am." His words were clipped, practical, but that odd tug persisted. Sarah's shoulders drooped almost imperceptibly. "I understand, sir. We've had a difficult journey, but I assure you, I'm a hard worker. And Lily, she's very quiet, very well behaved." She looked down at her daughter, a silent plea passing between them. Jebediah looked at the two of them, standing there, clearly at the end of their rope. He needed help. The cabin was a disaster, and his cooking amounted to burnt beans and tougher-than-leather jerky. But a child? He was a man of solitude, of quiet routine. Then Lily looked up again, her gaze meeting his. There was no defiance, no childish demand, just a profound, unsettling sadness in those dark eyes. It was a look that bypassed his gruff exterior, bypassing his practicality, and landed squarely on something he rarely acknowledged, a hidden vulnerability. He saw a flicker of the lost fawn he'd once found, abandoned in a blizzard. The words came out before he'd fully processed them. "Come in, ma'am. Both of you." He stepped aside, a little bewildered by his own decision. The aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs suddenly felt less encompassing, as if making room for something new. New sounds, new smells. The scent of pine needles and damp earth that usually permeated Jebediah's cabin began to recede, replaced by something entirely new. Sarah, with a quiet determination that belied her gentle demeanor, had declared war on the grime. Armed with a bucket of hot water, a brush she'd found in the shed, and a bar of lye soap, she'd scrubbed the rough-hewn floorboards until their grain stood proud. The single window, once a hazy pane of accumulated dust, now sparkled, letting in a startling amount of daylight that chased the shadows from the corners. Jebediah, returning from checking his traps, paused on the porch. The air, usually thick with the faint scent of wood smoke and his own particular musk, now carried a faint, clean aroma, not flowery but simply fresh. He stepped inside, his boots clomping louder than usual in the suddenly spacious-feeling room. Sarah was at the crude stone hearth, kneading dough with a rhythmic, practiced motion, her hands dusted with flour. The heat of the fire, combined with the scent of yeast, promised something substantial. His stomach rumbled, an unbidden sound that made him feel foolish. He cleared his throat. Smells different in here. Sarah glanced up, a faint flush on her cheeks from the heat and exertion. Just trying to air things out, Mr. Stone. Bread'll be ready in an hour or so. He nodded, feeling a strange awkwardness settle over him. He usually ate his supper in silence, hunched over a tin plate, the only company the crackle of the fire. Now, a woman was baking bread in his cabin. It was an unsettling, yet not entirely unpleasant, sensation. He moved towards his usual chair, a worn wooden thing by the small table. As he sat, he felt a pair of eyes on him. Lily, perched on a stool near the window, her small hands clasped in her lap, watched him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. Her quiet presence was a constant, gentle hum in the background. But when her gaze settled on him, it was a physical weight. He shifted, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. He wasn't used to being observed, wasn't used to anyone seeing him outside the context of his work. He felt a funny prickle on the back of his neck, a self-consciousness he hadn't known since he was a boy, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He grunted, pulling out a worn knife to clean beneath his fingernails, hoping to appear preoccupied. The tinkle of a tune. The late afternoon sun, a tired orange, stretched long shadows across Jebediah's cluttered workshop. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams, illuminating forgotten tools and stacks of aged wood. Lily, usually content to play with a handful of polished river stones by the porch, had been drawn by the rhythmic thunk-thunk of Jebediah's hammer. She stood just inside the doorway, a small, still figure, her gaze sweeping over the chaos. Her eyes, wide and curious, landed on a tarnished wooden box hucked away on a high shelf, half hidden behind a coil of rope. It was a small thing, no bigger than her two hands pressed together, its dark wood scratched and dull. A hint of ornate carving was visible beneath a layer of grime, and a tiny, rusty key protruded from one side. Her quiet inquiry, a mere whisper, barely reached Jebediah over the clang of metal. "What's that?" she asked, pointing a tentative finger. Jebediah grunted, lowering the hammer. He followed her gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. "Just an old trinket. No good for anything." He'd acquired it in a trade years ago, and it had sat, forgotten, ever since. But Lily's eyes, fixed on the box, held an intensity that was hard to ignore. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly beneath the shelf, craning her neck. With a sigh that was more habit than irritation, Jebediah set down his hammer. He reached up, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate as he retrieved the box. It felt surprisingly light in his palm. He brushed a layer of dust from its surface with his thumb, revealing a faded floral motif etched into the lid. Lily's breath hitched, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. He sat on a low stool, the box resting on his knee. He didn't look at Lily, but his fingers, rough from years of labor, carefully turned the small, rusty key. It scraped with a protesting groan, but then, with a soft click, it wound tight. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Then slowly, he lifted the lid. A hesitant, sweet melody, thin and delicate, tinkled into the dusty air. It was a tune Lily had never heard before, a cascade of high, clear notes that sounded like tiny bells chiming in a gentle breeze. Her eyes, already wide, grew impossibly larger. reflecting the faint light from the workshop window. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, transforming her features. It wasn't the tentative, polite smile she sometimes offered her mother, but a genuine, unburdened expression of pure wonder. Jebediah felt a jolt, sharp and unexpected, deep within his chest. The smile, so bright and unreserved, was like a sudden sunrise in the shadowed corners of his solitary world. He hadn't realized how much he craved such simple joy, how long it had been since he'd witnessed such unblemished happiness. He found himself unable to look away, the small tinkling tune weaving itself into the unexpected warmth spreading through him. In that moment, the weight of years, of hard-won independence, seemed to lift, if only for a fleeting second. The rusty old music box, long forgotten, had suddenly played a far more profound tune than he could have ever imagined. The gathering storm. A peculiar stillness descended upon the valley that afternoon. A hush that swallowed the usual rustle of the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. The air grew heavy, almost viscous, pressing down on the cabin like an unseen weight. Jebediah, splitting kindling by the woodpile, paused, his axe mid-swing. He glanced up at the sky, his eyes narrowing. The cerulean expanse of morning had receded, replaced by a bruised purple hue spreading rapidly from the west. It wasn't just clouds. It was a solid, churning mass, pregnant with malice. Inside, Sarah May noticed it too. The light filtering through the small window had taken on an eerie, greenish cast, making the familiar cabin feel alien. Lily, who had been quietly arranging some wildflowers on the rough-hewn table, looked up, her bright eyes wide with apprehension. A low, mournful sigh of wind snaked around the cabin, rattling a loose pane in the kitchen. "Looks like we're in for a real gully washer," Jebediah rumbled, stepping inside, carrying an armload of wood. His voice was gruff, but his gaze flickered towards Lily, who had edged closer to her mother's skirt. He threw the logs into the wood box with a clatter, then walked to the window, peering out. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the glass, sounding like tiny stones. The wind began to keen now, a mournful, rising wail that seemed to search for entry points, whistling through cracks in the old timber. It shook the entire structure, making the lantern hanging from the ceiling sway hypnotically. Lily's small hands clutched Sarah May's dress, her knuckles white. Her lower lip trembled. She had seen storms before, but never one that felt so personal, so alive. Each gust seemed to scream her name. "It's all right, sweetheart," Sarah May murmured, pulling her daughter closer, stroking her hair. Her own heart beat a little faster, but she kept her voice steady. She glanced at Jebediah, who stood silently at the window, his broad back to them. He was a rock, unwavering, but even he seemed to sense the immense power gathering outside. Suddenly, a violent gust slammed against the cabin, making the whole structure groan like a wounded beast. A shower of twigs and leaves scraped against the roof, followed by a deeper, guttural roar as the wind tore through the surrounding trees. Lily let out a small whimper, burying her face against her mother's side. The cabin, usually a sanctuary, now felt exposed, fragile, a tiny boat adrift on a raging sea. The gathering darkness outside was absolute, punctuated only by the flickering glow of the stove and the small defiant lamp. Brave in the storm, the wind howled like a banshee tearing at the cabin's very foundations. Rain, thick and relentless, hammered against the single window pane, blurring the already ink-black night into an indistinguishable chaos. Inside, the flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the storm's frantic energy. Jebediah sat by the hearth, whittling a small bird from a piece of pine, his face a mask of concentration. Sarah May knitted quietly, her needles clicking a rhythmic counterpoint to the tempest outside. Lily, nestled between them on a rough-spun blanket, clutched a worn rag doll, her wide eyes darting nervously from her mother to Jebediah. Then it started. A sharp, insistent thud, followed by a grating screech and another resounding thwack. It was the sound of a loose board, somewhere on the exterior wall, being ripped and slammed by the gale. Each strike was a physical jolt to the small cabin, making the dishes rattle and the floorboards groan. Lily's breath hitched. She buried her face into Sarah May's side, a small whimper escaping her lips. The rhythmic banging grew louder, more aggressive, sounding less like wood against wood and more like a monstrous beast clawing at their sanctuary. "It's just the wind, Sweet Pea," Sarah May murmured, stroking Lily's hair. But her own gaze flickered towards the wall, where the sound seemed to originate. Jebediah stopped whittling, his calloused thumb tracing the smooth curve of the bird's wing. He squinted, listening intently to the relentless assault. The thudding grew more violent, punctuated by a tearing sound that sent a shiver down Sarah May's spine. Lily's whimper escalated into a full-blown sob, her small frame trembling uncontrollably. "Mama, it's going to get us," she cried, her voice thin and reedy against the storm's roar. Her fear was palpable, a raw, innocent terror that pierced through Jebediah's stoic composure. He saw the genuine distress in her tear-streaked face. The way her eyes, usually so observant, were now clouded with fright. Without a word, Jebediah rose. Sarah May looked up, her expression a mix of alarm and understanding. "Jebediah, no, it's too dangerous out there," she protested, the words barely audible above the tempest. He merely grunted, already moving towards the heavy oak door. He pulled on a thick, oilskin coat, cinching it tightly around him, and grabbed a hammer from a hook near the door. The wind shrieked a warning as he wrestled the heavy latch open. A blast of icy wind and rain immediately surged into the cabin, extinguishing the lamp's flame and plunging them into near darkness, save for the glow of the hearth. Sarah May gasped, pulling Lily closer. Through the momentary gap, she saw Jebediah, a sturdy silhouette against the furious night, vanish into the impenetrable blackness, swallowed by the storm's maelstrom. Lily's sobs intensified, now laced with a new kind of fear, the fear of him being out there. Sarah May hugged her daughter tighter, her heart pounding, listening for any sound other than the storm's furious roar, praying for his safe return. A warm embrace. The door to the cabin burst open, not with a gentle creak, but a forceful shove that sent a blast of damp air swirling through the warm space. Jebediah stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the fading, bruised sky. Rainwater sluiced from the brim of his wide-brimmed hat, carving rivulets through the mud caked on his cheeks. His oilskin duster, stiff with grime, clung to his broad shoulders, and the shovel in his hand dripped a steady patter onto the plank floor. He looked less like a man returning from a chore and more like a weary titan who had wrestled the storm itself and, by some miracle, emerged victorious. "It's done," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual, a testament to the howling wind he'd battled. He dropped the shovel with a clatter, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet that followed his announcement. His eyes, usually fixed on the distant horizon, scanned the small room, landing on the corner where Lily sat, hunched over a faded picture book. Lily, who had been tracing a finger along the faded image of a prairie dog, startled at the sudden intrusion. Her head snapped up, those wide, expressive eyes going even wider. For a split second, fear flickered, a primal instinct born from too much chaos and uncertainty. But then, as she took in Jebediah's disheveled but undeniably present form, the tension in her small shoulders visibly eased. A fragile smile, hesitant at first, blossomed on her face. Before Jebediah could even shed his coat, before he could utter another word, Lily launched herself from her chair. Her tiny legs, usually so cautious, propelled her across the room with surprising speed. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She simply launched herself at him, a small, determined projectile. He braced for impact, expecting perhaps a shy tug on his trouser leg or a quiet plea for comfort. What he received instead was a full-body embrace. Her small arms wrapped around his muddy leg, holding on with a surprising ferocity. Her face pressed against the rough fabric of his trousers, and he could feel the small tremor of her body, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Jebediah froze. His hands, accustomed to the rough handle of a shovel or the reins of a horse, hung awkwardly in the air. He hadn't been held like this he couldn't even recall. Not since he was a boy, perhaps. A warmth, unfamiliar and startling, bloomed in his chest, chasing away the chill of the storm. It was a sensation both uncomfortable and profoundly comforting. He could feel the soft weight of her head against his leg, the fierce grip of her small hands. It was an embrace that spoke volumes without a single word, a silent declaration of relief and affection. He slowly, almost experimentally, lowered one hand, his calloused fingers hovering inches from her hair. He didn't quite touch her, not yet. The gesture was too new, too vulnerable. But the simple, powerful act of her holding him, of her finding solace in his muddy, disheveled presence, lodged itself deep within him, a seed in the barren landscape of his heart. The storm outside might have raged, but in the quiet cabin, a different kind of warmth had begun to take hold. Stories and whistles, the last embers of the storm, had died with the dawn, leaving the cabin air crisp and the world outside washed clean. But something else had shifted too, a subtle yet profound change in Jebediah Stone. The gruff edges that had defined him seemed softened, worn down by the shared vulnerability of the night. Lily, still small and quiet, felt the difference keenly. That evening, as the fire crackled a cheerful tune, Jebediah didn't immediately retreat to his corner with his pipe. Instead, he pulled a stool closer to the hearth, his shadow dancing on the rough-hewn walls. "Heard tell of a bear once," he began, his voice a low rumble that filled the silence. "Biggest critter I ever did see, up by the Bitterroot Peaks. Thought it was a shadow moving through the pines, till it stood up taller than a horse." Lily's eyes, wide and luminous in the flickering light, were fixed on him. She didn't speak, but her small hand, previously clutching the worn hem of her dress, slowly relaxed. He spun tales of prospectors striking gold in unexpected streams, of lone wolves howling under the full moon, of the vast untamed beauty of the wilderness. His words painted pictures in the air, And Lily, mesmerized, leaned forward, her breath held captive by each new adventure. She'd never heard such stories, not from her mother, not from anyone. They were wild and wonderful, tinged with the dust and danger of a world she was only just beginning to know. Later, after the stories had faded into the quiet hum of the fire, Jebediah produced a small sharp knife and a block of pine. "See here," he said, his callous thumb tracing a curve in the wood. "You gotta feel the grain. Let it tell you where to cut." He began to whittle, thin shaving curling away from the blade. Slowly, painstakingly, the wood transformed. First, a simple ear, then a snout, until a tiny, perfectly formed squirrel emerged, its tail a delicate curl. He placed it in Lily's small, outstretched hand. The wood was smooth, warm from his touch, and smelled faintly of pine resin. Lily ran her finger over its tiny paws, a tentative smile gracing her lips. From then on, the evenings took on a new rhythm. Jebediah would always have a new story, a new piece of wood to carve, a rabbit, a watchful owl, a sturdy bear. He even started sharing his supper, pushing his tin plate a little closer to hers, making sure she had a generous portion of stew or a slice of fresh-baked bread. One particularly cold morning, he found her shivering by the stove. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and draped it over her small shoulders. The coat, too large and smelling of wood smoke and leather, enveloped her in a cocoon of warmth. Lily looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the unspoken gratitude that bloomed in her heart. Jebediah just grunted, turning back to his coffee, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, upwards. Home, sweet home. The cabin air, thick with the aroma of simmering venison stew, rich with wild onions and carrots, now carried the faint sweet promise of baking bread. A symphony Jebediah had never imagined his rough-hewn dwelling could produce. He sat at the worn pine table, ostensibly sharpening his hunting knife, though his gaze continually strayed. In the corner, Lily, her tiny hands clutching a wooden doll Sarah had carved from a fallen branch, hummed a tuneless lullaby. Sarah, her back to him, echoed the tune as she kneaded dough with fluid, practiced movements. The late afternoon sun, usually just a stark beam in an empty space, now painted warm stripes across their figures, setting dust motes dancing like miniature, golden galaxies. A quiet chuckle escaped Jebediah, so unfamiliar a sound it startled even him. Lily's head snapped up, her wide eyes, the color of moss after a spring rain, locking with his. She offered a hesitant, almost imperceptible smile before returning to her doll. Sarah paused, turning with a question in her gentle gaze. Jebediah merely grunted, a familiar sound, yet his usual gruffness was softened by a genuine, if fleeting, smile. He recalled the long, silent evenings that once defined his existence. The crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind through the eaves, those were his solitary companions. Now, the cabin pulsed with a different kind of life. Lily's soft patter chasing a sunbeam, Sarah's quiet hums, the occasional clatter of pots. It wasn't mere noise. It was a melody, one that had replaced the desolate silence in his heart. His thumb grazed the knife's blade, no longer truly focused on its edge. This place, once his solitary retreat, had undergone an astonishing transformation. The rough-hewn walls, once just shelter, now felt like an embrace. The hearth, where he'd cooked countless lonely meals, now held the promise of shared warmth. It wasn't merely a cabin anymore. It was a home. And they, Sarah and Lily, were not just occupants. They were its very essence. Jebediah watched Sarah as she placed the dough into the cast-iron pot, ready for baking. Her movements were graceful, even in the plain calico dress she wore. He remembered the wary look in her eyes when she first arrived, the tight set of her jaw. That tension had eased, replaced by a quiet contentment that suited her. And Lily, once a shadow clinging to her mother's skirts, now explored the corners of the cabin with budding curiosity, her initial fear yielding to newfound comfort. A strange warmth spread through Jebediah's chest, one that had nothing to do with the roaring fire. He wasn't just a lonely old man anymore. He was something else. A protector, perhaps. A provider, certainly. But more than that, he was part of this. Part of the laughter that sometimes bubbled up from Lily. Part of the quiet strength in Sarah's gaze. He was part of a family, a word he hadn't dared to truly consider in decades. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, but mostly it was profoundly, undeniably sweet.